This is WCUW's Radio Horror Show here on the 15th anniversary of Radio Horror. And tonight on the show with us, we have a rather distinguished writer, producer, director on the show with us. Somebody I've been looking forward to having on for quite a number of years and been a long-time fan of his work. From Bride of Reanimator, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, Necronomicon, Book of the Dead, and Return of the Living Dead Part 3, and many other films, we have Brian Yuzna on the show with us. Thank you for coming on the show with us, Brian.
My pleasure. Thanks to you.
I have, like I said, been a fan of your films for such an incredibly long time. Before I was even supposed to be watching them, I was a fan of your movies.
That's the best time to watch them.
When you talk to people today, what is one thing that probably more people will always point out and associate with you more?
Well, it depends on which movie they first saw, I guess. It used to always be Reanimator. And then in the last 10 or 12 years, it now seems to be more Society than Reanimator. But then there's people who have, other kinds of interests. Sometimes I'll get Guyver people, because they're into the anime. So it depends. I think mostly people look at me and they think horror.
That's probably true. And then, of course, people always... the one thing I come to learn as I came to learn more about you is that, a lot of the stuff that you come from is horror, of course, and then it takes a completely weird direction with Disney, with the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids series. But even in that, it has its horror elements. It has its body horror elements being shrunk down to a microscopic level as well. So I guess it's not too far removed from one to the other.
Well, I think that that fantasy and horror are two sides of the same coin. So most horror movies, if you brighten them up and give it a good ending, they're fantasy films. And most fantasy films, if you darken the light and give it a bad ending, it's a horror movie. So certainly, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids could be easily a horror movie. I mean, their father could have stepped on them out there in the yard. It's not a given. They could have gotten killed by a attacking spider or something. There's a lot of ways to go with it. But I think that I do think they're very, very much connected. And, I loved horror as much. I loved fantasy when I was growing up as well. I started, when I was real young, I was really into fairy tales, and they're pretty horrific. One of the early movies that really affected me was the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, which was Ray Harryhausen, and that's certainly a fantasy film. But my God, it's got the Cyclops, it's got the dragon, it's got skeleton fighting, sword fighting. It's got a woman that gets morphed with a snake. I mean, it's a horror movie, but it really was a kid's fantasy movie as well.
There's something coming up that's in pre-production on online called Shrunk. Is that connected to the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids series?
It might be Disney. If it's by Disney, it would be. Disney wouldn't tell me. I'm not in touch with them. They wouldn't have any interest in keeping me up to date. At one point they were going to remake Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and then I quit seeing anything about that. So I don't know. Shrunk sounds like the kind of thing that Disney would do with a remake, doesn't it?
Yeah, instead of calling Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, they just call it Shrunked. Do something else, but keeping it a familiar title that people would recognize.
Yeah, Shrunk. That sounds like it's a sequel to Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. It says here on IMDb. So that's good for me if it is.
One of your films in particular, I found back in the old Blockbuster VHS days that I'm still shocked to this very day. Has never had any kind of disc release. I was wondering if you could shed some light on it. Necronomicon, one of my really kind of like rare favorite horror movies. Absolutely love that film to death, but it's never been given any kind of like release whatsoever in the States for a disc.
Yeah, it's odd. It was has a lot to do with the company that controlled the distribution rights. That movie was a co-production with a Japanese producer and a French producer, and each one got certain territories, their own territories, and then they were able to share the rest of the world. But the French company controlled the rights, and for some reason they just didn't. They sold it originally to New Line. I had great hopes for it. I thought it should get a theatrical release. I thought it could do real well, which doesn't mean a lot because my taste doesn't coincide very often with the popular taste. But they did release it on, I guess it was VHS when it came out. That was back in the 90s. And then in France, it got a huge release, of course, because they were promoting Christophe Gans, who was the director of the first episode. And it got a big release with like tons of extras. I think there were like 6 hours of extras. I even went to Paris and did some of the extras, did a voice over, did a commentary and interviews and stuff. But in the U.S., New Line had it, and they probably still have it and probably just don't care to do anything with it. So one of the, kind of, I don't know if it's a dirty secret or even a secret, but one of the facts about movies is that if they're not out there, being hawked, it used to be if they're not out on Blockbuster, if they're not on Netflix, if they're not being pushed, they don't exist. And that's that's, if I owned Necronomicon, believe me, I'd have a 4K Blu-ray special edition out there because I think there's fans for that. But for a New Line, they have bigger fish to fry, and the bigger companies, the movies that they own, really become just it's like real estate that they use to get lines of credit from banks, and I saw this very clearly on From Beyond, for example. I was looking to see who had the sequel rights, and I looked up, went to the, you can go online and go to the Library of Congress, and you can look up any movie and see who owns it. You'll see who copyrighted it originally, and you'll see every time there's been, any liens on it or when it's sold. It'll all be registered at the Library of Congress, and I found that From Beyond, the last mention of it had been that it was From Beyond plus 3,826 other films as collateral against a Citibank loan. So you see, MGM, who owned it, they use those huge catalogs as kind of like value to borrow, get lines of credit against to make their new movies. or just operating expenses. So, that's something that people don't understand, but is really important. If a movie isn't out there, if they're not pushing it, it kind of doesn't exist.
That's so weird because you think about like companies like Vestron Home Media, Blue Underground, Scream Factory, the biggest one probably, and all of the really weird, oddball B movie horror films from the ones that were in theaters to the ones that went straight to straight to home video back in the 80s and 90s. They have been releasing them. Vestron, Arrow, Live Entertainment, whatever the new company is. There's so many, but it's so weird that there are certain films, and you're right, it may have something to do with like maybe copyright or the studios just don't care, or maybe nobody's asking the studio. But I know I've seen Necronomicon on the list of like the top 20 films that still have never gotten a Blu-ray release, let alone a DVD release. Fright Night Part 2 is on there, but the reasons for that are been pretty well known for a while now, and other things. And it's definitely one of those films that just it lends itself to get out there and get on a disc.
Yeah, that's.
I'm sure you would want to do, and I'm sure you would probably do, interviews and special features or a commentary for it or something.
Well, of course I would. I do everything I can to support the movies I've been involved with, because hey, they're special to me, and I want to tell the story of those movies. You are right. It is strange that Scream Factory, for example, hasn't put out Necronomicon. But I wonder how many New Line. It's got to be about New Line, because I think they still must have the rights to it, because I think they probably got a 25-year thing, year license on the North American rights. But it certainly would deserve it. That's for sure. I even introduced a 35 millimeter screening a few years ago at the Egyptian Theater here in Hollywood, of Necronomicon, and I think I may have the only print of it. I used my print, which had kind of deteriorated a little. But you are. I think it's not a great movie, but it's uneven. But God, there's just a lot of cool stuff in it. I think it really has some good horror in it. It's got it's got a lot of positives, that movie.
It does. I think it's one of the best short film anthology collections out there that people have never heard of before. And look at Trick or Treat. Trick or Treat, very famous film. It's finally actually getting a nationwide limited. I think it's only going to be for a weekend, but it's actually going to get its first ever nationwide theatrical release coming up in October.
Huh.
And that movie was, kind of shelved by Warner Bros. Because they didn't know what to do with it until all of a sudden a lot of the actors in it were blowing up and becoming huge stars like Anna Paquin and such.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's just always just baffled me about that film, and I was just like, what is going on? But it's one of my, again, favorite anthology films ever, and it definitely needs more deserving of the love. Another film that I put out there a lot, and I would just, there's a great Blu-ray release of it, but I met Stuart Gordon back in 2013, and he showed us like an uncut version of the film, which I don't think ever got onto the Blu-ray. Dagon is one of my favorite H.P. Lovecraft stories ever, turned into a movie.
Yeah, that's I think that is maybe the best or the truest Lovecraft adaptation. I think it is. Most Lovecraft adaptations are kind of go fairly far afield from the story, and generally for good reason. But I think Dagon is a really kind of a real true adaptation of Shadow over Innsmouth. And I was surprised when that movie didn't get it didn't get much love when it was released.
It should have.
I think so.
I mean, it's great. It's so dark and messed up. And it was so in 2013 when Stewart came to Providence to show off the uncut version of the movie, he had just come on the show, the same one that you're on right now, the week before, and I got to sit with him and his wife Carolyn and some producer friend of theirs, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, and watch the movie with them in the theaters, and that was awesome.
Mm-hmm.
That was fantastic. Do you have any really cool, interesting stories about Stewart?
Well, I mean, he certainly was kind of a force of nature, and one of the most, I think, I used to always think he was just the best at telling stories using actors, because he had been when we made both our first feature films, which was Reanimator, he had already been directing theater for a decade. He was a professional director. And I think to a certain degree, that's why Reanimator was so astounding, was that we weren't used to seeing kind of like a cheap exploitative horror movie directed so well. Usually you get someone who doesn't really have a lot of directing chops. They're starting out. So he was really terrific for that, but he was also very dogged. And I guess he kept, always push. And I think one of my favorite anecdotes about him is when we were shooting Dolls. We were in Italy, in Rome, shooting it. And he just kept, as we kind of our schedule ran out, the furniture decoration house came to get the sets, came to get the sofas and the beds and all the stuff we rented for the movie. And I remember that this was the last day of shooting, and Stewart just wouldn't stop shooting. And I remember once he was shooting the doll, one of the dolls, and he had it on a sofa, and he was shooting it, and the Italian workers actually came right in and took that sofa away while the camera was pointed at it. And Stewart didn't miss a beat. He just grabbed that doll, put it on a chair, had him turn the camera, and kept shooting. You've worked in the crossover of sci-fi, fantasy, horror, in many different aspects. But as a personally yourself, what's your what's a film that you are extremely passionate about that you didn't work on? Oh, well, I guess there's just too many of those, aren't there? I couldn't pick one. I mean, we all have such. I mean, you could just make a list of 1,000. I love Videodrome, for example. I would have loved to have working on that. If you want to go back further, of course, I would have liked. Rosemary's Baby. My God, that's a classic. So I don't know. I think there's just too many of them to even begin on that.
I worked with, and by work with, I mean he works for me and I've paid him. So he's an artist that was worked on my gender swap Dracula. We took the entire cast of Dracula and we gender swapped it. And this artist has done 3 covers for me now on 3 different books, plus interior pages. Tim Vigil.
Oh, he did Faust.
Yeah.
Love the Damned. Yeah.
Faust. I had not seen Faust until just a few weeks ago. There was a very popular YouTuber did a big review of Faust, and then I was able to contact you and have you come on the show. what was that like working on Faust? Because I know the film is kind of all over the place with the fans. I've heard stuff about behind the scenes, but I would love to hear it from your perspective about Faust. Any particular stories and anything that you want to talk about?
Well, it's a big subject. Faust was actually the kickoff of 10 movies that I did in Spain. I had in '99 I moved to Spain and got this company in Barcelona, a Spanish company, to create a label. I wanted to do a label, like a hammer label. I called it the Fantastic Factory. And so the idea was to make these movies in Spain, but make it not look like they were done in Spain. Make them be like regular, like LA, international horror movies, and then develop further into not having to do that. And the first movie, Dagon was one of those movies. Beyond Reanimator was, Arachnid, I forget all the rest of them. And Faust was the first one. And Faust was a script that a friend of mine, Ted Chalmers, had developed with Tim Vigil, based on the comics. Now the comics are quite graphic and kind of pornographic, actually. And at one point, Stewart was working on it with Ted Chalmers, and then it just didn't get made. And when I moved to Spain, I was looking for 4 movies that I could take to the market to sell. I mean, not movies, but projects to get get financing for the Spanish company. And the first one that I was going to make was Faust. Well, actually, I had Faust. I asked Stewart which one he wanted to direct, and he chose Dagon, and so I did Faust. And I started by directing Faust because I didn't want to have an American director, for example, in Spain, where the whole crew is Spanish, and I'm trying to figure out if we can even make movies there that'll fit the bill. The Spanish at that time didn't do these genre movies and were rather skeptical of them. And so with Faust, that was kind of a comic book movie. And of course, this is comic book before CGI, the way we know comic books today. And I wanted it to look like it took place in the U.S., and I wanted it to seem like it was a U.S. production. But really, except for a couple of the actors, Jeffrey Combs is in it, for example, and a couple of British actors. And so everybody is Spanish, all the actors. So you're basically having there were people who, English was not their first language by any stretch of the imagination. And then we were trying to make Barcelona look like a U.S. city. And I'd never shot in Spain, and I didn't know what level their effects were at, for example, and they were nowhere. I mean, we really didn't have, I'm talking about stunts and effects. Now, I brought Screaming Mad George over to do the Faust effects, and I was someone, I couldn't quite get my head around the superhero thing, and there's no way we were going to afford to buy the James Brown tunes. So instead, I made the soundtrack heavy with heavy metal music. And then I also just didn't know how to do, back then, a superhero was like, you know, Superman in the 70s or something. It was like, you know, tights. They were, they were in like tights with silk, cape. And so it was, so George and I came up with the idea that Faust it would be more like his skin itself would kind of, like the Hulk. His skin itself would become the outfit, and he would be pretty crazy. And so I tried a lot to kind of be true a little bit to the comic books, the vision of the comic books. And in fact, I asked the guys to come out to Barcelona and work with the art department to create the look of it, but they declined. And I had no idea what we could pull off in Barcelona, and we didn't, we weren't able to shoot everything. So it was very uneven, and but it did show it did show that we could make a movie in Spain and make it, and it could sell and make its money back. And that's actually, it made it so that I was able to make the whole label in Spain. And that just happened to be the one that was the most, of course, it was pretty much the most difficult, because I was just trying to figure out how to be able to work with Spanish crew, work with Spanish actors, and get them to, and come up with a system so that we could make a lot of movies in Spain. The movie is definitely uneven, and there's certainly some things that I was never happy with the monster at the end, the homunculus. In the comic, I think it's more of a werewolf. I didn't kind of like that much, but I did have some other ways to go with it, and that perhaps would have worked better. But ultimately, we shot until we ran out of money, and it did well enough that I was able to make 9 more movies in Spain.
That's fantastic. A friend of mine I had mentioned that you were coming on my show, and she pointed out to me that Return of the Living Dead Part 3 is one of her favorite movies of all time. She didn't get no explanation about why, but it's incredibly different than the last 2 Return of the Living Dead movies. What was the why did you go in the direction that you did with that film? Because it's a really kind of self-contained standalone story, and really ignited this very craze of evil punk goth chicks love this film, love that main character.
I think it's a really good movie, and I think it's one of the best zombie movies, on my list. I was really happy to get the chance to do that movie. The second one had not been very successful, and so that kind of made the value of the third one take a dive, and I guess that's why I got to do it. But my goal for it was that, first of all, the one thing I wanted was to make the one of the living dead the main character, because I thought that would change the dynamic. And then my other goal was that I saw the movie as being like the second sequel to the alternate sequel to the movie that kind of began the modern age of horror. So in my book, Night of the Living Dead is the movie that kind of began the era that we're in horror. And I don't think you can overstate its importance. And Dawn of the Dead carried that forward, Day of the Dead less, but Night of the Living Dead is something really special, I think. Now, because the writer of Night of the Living Dead was able to keep the rights to the name Living Dead, the sequel to Night of the Living Dead was called Dawn of the Dead because George Romero gave up the right to use Living Dead in the title. Now, the rights to do a sequel that's called Living Dead ended up with, I think it's a guy named Joe Wolf, and he was involved with getting Dan O'Bannon to write and direct it. And maybe your listeners will know that Dan O'Bannon, they probably know him best from having, directed Return of the Living Dead, but from having written Alien and written a lot of other horror movies. And so he did something really amazing with Return of the Living Dead. He figured out how to put EC Comics on screen. Now, I grew up, when I was a kid, I bought horror comics. And EC Comics, when people tried to do horror comics on screen, they would do Creepshow. They would do it like it was a 60s or 70s TV show, like the Batman TV show or something, where the way they did comics on screen is they would put the frames and they would make it, kind of bright, colorful, and zoom, bang, pow, that kind of thing. But nobody quite figured out how to put EC Comics, which was full of, it's always people killing each other and chopping each other heads off and eating their brains. Well, Dan O'Bannon just did a fantastic job of doing Return of the Living Dead, which was an alternate sequel to Night of the Living Dead, and he figured out how to make a real horror comic book. After that, of course, Joel Silver took that whole style and made Tales from the Crypt, and that was all. And from my point of view, that's Dan O'Bannon made that possible. So I really love Return of the Living Dead. And I loved what Dan did with the mythology of it. Now, Night of the Living Dead wasn't funny at all. Now, Dawn of the Dead was ironic. Not really funny, but ironic. But in Night of the Living Dead, we didn't know why the dead were coming back to life. On the radio, it kind of indicated that maybe it had something to do with some satellite coming back from outer space or something.
Yep.
And in Dawn of the Dead, they said, on the poster, they said, when hell is full, the dead will walk the earth, which I think is one of the great taglines ever for a zombie movie, because I like the macabre side of zombies a lot. And that was really, to me, very, that was just such a great tagline. It's like, they're just coming back, man. Too many people have died. Hell is full. Well, Dan O'Bannon took that whole thing and subverted it and said that in his book, it was this marijuana, this marijuana.
Brian.
So what Dan O'Bannon did with the mythology of the living dead was he just decided it was an herbicide that the government had developed to eradicate marijuana plants. And that's kind of a countercultural thing. And Dan was also a big pot smoker, so he found it really hilarious. So the idea was that this was a gas to kill marijuana plants, but it had this unfortunate side effect that it kind of killed people and brought them back to life. And they became zombies or living dead. And then Dan made it, took that idea and then made them eat brains. Now, eating brains is just kind of an old EC Comics kind of thing. That it's just like horror, brain eating. And he took this style to it, this very rich plastics look to the movie, a real pulpy look, and it was very grisly, but kind of really funny and real sexy. Had it set around a bunch of kids with their radios, kind of punk kids, and going to the cemetery. Of course, we remember Linnea Quigley's iconic performance. And he also did something that was beyond a bit what had been being done by in the Romero movies, which was he made the Tar Man. And the Tar Man had been in a crate of this gas, and he was like a real comic book character. He was just, his skin had just kind of turned into slop.
Yeah, it's funny that both those films, the Tar Man and Julia, right? That's her name from Part 3.
Julia.
Yeah, they're probably so iconic. You think of Freddy and Jason and Michael and Dracula and Wolfman, so on and so forth. You also think of Tar Man and Julia, and definitely need more horror icons in for females too. You know what I mean? And definitely creating Julia did that. But definitely like Tar Man, when you think of like Living Dead, you that immediately comes to mind.
That's really the one. Yeah, I mean, he was just a great performance, and that was kind of the genius of Dan O'Bannon. He's so original that. But
I met his widow too, by the way. The same convention I met Stewart, I met his widow.
Yeah, well, he was really something, and so anyway, I loved it, and when the company was called Trimark and offered me I was going to produce and direct it, and I asked them going in because I had seen the second movie. And the second movie suffered from, in a way, I thought it was trying to be too funny. And unfortunately, they put in all the actors that had been in the first one, and a number of them had already been dead. So it was just kind of awkward. And I asked Trimark, the producing company, the studio, I said, well, listen, does this movie have to be funny? And they said no. And I said, does it do I have to use any of the characters from the other two movies? No. Do I have to use the actors? No. So I said, what do I have to do? What is the obligation? And they said, you got to have the gas and you've got to have brain eating. So that's the only given that I had going into it. And because in my mind, I had the great opportunity. I know a lot of people don't like to direct sequels. I've always liked to. I love the challenge of making a sequel. And when I looked at this, I thought, wow, I get to make a sequel, not only to Return of the Living Dead, but to Night of the Living Dead. Because Return of the Living Dead is the alternate sequel to Night of the Living Dead. So I didn't want to make it funny because Night of the Living Dead wasn't funny. But I wanted to give it, I had to use the trioxin gas and the barrels, and I wanted the style of the zombies to be in that Dan O'Bannon comic book style, and I wanted to make I wanted the main character to be a zombie, and I wanted I wanted it to be I wanted it to be like a punk, a goth chick. And I began hearing pitches from writers. And one of the pitches I heard was from a screenwriter named John V. Penny. And John Penny pitched me this whole idea of this Romeo and Juliet type story, where the boy's father was in the military with this project to use the trioxin gas to make warriors, to make soldiers that couldn't be stopped. And the girl would be the Juliet character. That's why we called her Julie. She would be the one that, the kid would be straight and narrow, military kid, and she would be the one leading them astray, the goth chick who's very liberated. And it turns out she has a real, like a lot of goths, there's sort of this death obsession thing. So so John came up with that whole story about how the military has developed the living dead into soldiers, but the way they would control them is by freezing them. They'd shoot a bullet at them. And the first zombie you see in Return of the Living Dead 3 is this very skinny guy being tied up while they put the gas on him and then freeze him. Well, that character is for me was the homage to the Tarman character, except the Tarman had been dead a long time. But the way Dan did the Tarman, he's got a super skinny guy and had him dance, with the suit on, the makeup and the suit. And so we got this real skinny guy, actually, who I forget who it was. I think it's our effects supervisor, Tom Ranoni, had found this guy in the LAX airport living there. He's like a homeless guy. And he was just as skinny as could be. And so we hired him and put him up at a motel and gave him the job. And by the end of this is straight out of Bowfinger, but by the end of the shoot, that guy, his name was Clarence. He had headshots made and was giving out his headshots. He was going to be an actor now. A typical Hollywood kind of story. But so we really tried hard to make the monsters really special. For example, the barrel zombie that his head is fused to his chest and then pulls it away. I mean, that's real. That's that real kind of gooey horror zombie, and certainly in the EC Comics Dan O'Bannon Return of the Living Dead world. And my effects supervisor, who is the one, I always would have a supervisor and use a lot of different effects companies, and he would be the one who would figure out who would get which job and keep up with them. And that was a guy named Tom Ranoni, and he really had a lot to do with the look of those characters and the whole heart of the movie, which is I think why it really works, is because it's a very romantic movie. It's a very emotional movie, and that's from the writer John Penny. So we were really lucky to get kind of a good mix of creative and technical people. And with Julie, I had seen, I live right in Hollywood, close to the Chinese Theater. And I remember one day I was driving to the corner, and as I was turning, I saw a couple of girls walking down the sidewalk, and one of them was dressed the way Julie is in the movie. She had those boots and the kind of net hose that's kind of torn, that kind of Harlequin type thing, mm-hmm. and the cut off jeans, and then she had the red hair and everything. And when I saw her, I thought, oh, that's the way Julie needs to. That's how she should dress. And then I wanted her to do, I wanted her to be iconic. I wanted her to be like a real iconic character. And so I just thought, one of the things that occurred to me was to have her have glass shards in her head and stuff. And so we I was thinking about scarification, tattooing, piercings, stuff like that. I mean, this was back in 92 or 3. So that kind of stuff was pretty edgy back then. I mean, today it's not such a big deal, but back then it was very edgy. And John Penny, the writer, and I we even went to a bunch of fetish clubs here in LA, these weird fetish clubs to where people do that kind of stuff. And we talked to people to figure out why they did, why did they do scarification or piercings and all this. And so then I came up with this idea that once she died and was brought back, that she starts having, how Dan did it in Return of the Living Dead. He showed the stages of realizing you're dead. And so I had to put in the brain eating. So the way I justified that in a movie that wasn't a comedy was that I decided that, and I used this same kind of idea in Beyond Reanimator. I decided that the reason that the living dead want to eat people. Now in in George Romero, the dead are ghouls and they just eat people. They're cannibals.
Right, they're brains mostly.
And in Night of the Living Dead, they're not brains. They just chew the bones and stuff.
Night of the Living Dead, it's bones and flesh. In Dan's films, it's brains, because they call the cop on the cop CB radio, send more cops.
Yeah. Well, so I had to justify that because I wasn't doing a comedy. Because I decided to go with the George Romero non-comedy, but go with the Dan O'Bannon, trioxin, and brain eating, which I was told I had to do. So what I tried to do was come up with a mythology that would justify that. And to justify it, I decided that a good way to go was to posit that when someone dies and is brought to life, they're alive, but they're dying while they're alive. They're not growing anymore. And what's happening is they're dying and it hurts. But what's dying first is the finer parts of your body, which are the nerves. So they're hurting because the nerves are dying, and it's like you're dead and you're decaying, but you're totally aware, which is a terrible idea, right? And so what they're doing is they're not biting into people to get their blood and flesh. They're getting the nerves. They're chewing in there to replenish their own nerves. And of course, the biggest bundle of nerves is in your cranium. Your brain is just a big nerve. So that was my justification for why they would do brain eating. And so to design Julie, I decided she should have that she would kind of attach like claws to her fingers and carry a rock so that she could break open heads and then claw out the brains like you would with an oyster or something. And that would justify a really cool look, which is those kind of wire claws that she has. And then I wanted her to have glass in her and be scarred up. And so I decided that a good justification for that is that once she's dead and she's starting to come to life, it hurts. She's hungry. She doesn't know what for. She'll find out that it's for nerves, for brains. And she finds that if she hurts herself, the pain will go away. Well, that's pretty typical with people who have had trauma as children. Sometimes people will cut themselves. I'm sure you've known people that have maybe had that problem, is they cut themselves if they maybe were abused as a child, because that will keep them from feeling the emotion. So translate that to her. She's cutting herself. She's scarifying herself, putting glass in herself, because the pain of that keeps the hunger away, keeps the dying away. And then, of course, to make it a romance, the other side of it is that she can get rid of the pain and the hunger by the love of Kurt, her boyfriend. So it's a love on one hand, and it's the pain on the other. And of course, eventually she gets too far gone, and she just kills Riverman, the good guy, and eats his brain. So that's the mythology of the movie, and that's why I purposefully didn't make it funny. And usually I'm really into irony in my movies, and I like that kind of ironic humor. And there is a little bit of it in Return of the Living Dead 3, but really it was because I felt like I was making a sequel not just to Return of the Living Dead, but I was also paying homage to George Romero's classic Night of the Living Dead, and so that was, that's not a funny movie, and I took so much from Dan that I felt like the movie should be played straight, and I don't know, I think it worked out real well, and I think it's one of the movies that I've made that I think turned out pretty much the way we planned it. I mean, that movie just it pretty much did what we set out to do. It was a little bit, it was cut back for the MPAA.
Yeah.
But it didn't really matter because
Well,
I think the story still gets across, and it's got a lot of cool stuff. I like the movie a lot.
So well talked about, and then they did two more after the third one, and they're almost completely forgettable. They were direct straight to DVD. I remember watching them. Necropolis was one of them, I think it was called, but I don't remember them at all. After Beyond Reanimator, was there, and this has always been like one of those like rumor things, and I think it's been confirmed, was there plans of doing like House of Reanimator?
Yeah. After Beyond Reanimator, and I was winding down my activities in Spain, I thought that I wanted to make a trilogy of Reanimators to finish out the saga. And the first one would be The House of Reanimator, and Stuart Gordon would direct it. And the second one would be what was it called? It was called
Bride of Reanimator.
No, it's called Beyond. No, the first three were Reanimator, Bride of Reanimator, Beyond Reanimator.
Right.
Then I wanted to make House of Reanimator, which is West in the White House, and then Reanimator Unbound, in which West would, for the first time, be totally financed and have all the lab he ever could dream of. He'd be like Dr. Moreau. And then the third one would be called Reanimator Begins, which would be West at the beginning of it, based on the Reanimator Unbound. He's lost his mind. He's got amnesia. He's in a mental hospital, and he gets taken out by Gruber's granddaughter, and they have to recreate the whole thing. So you kind of see what happened before the first Reanimator, except, of course, it's just replaying what could have happened before. I thought for sure I would be able to finance that, and at one point we just gave up on getting all three financed and just decided to do House of Reanimator, and Stuart's directing, and Dennis wrote a treatment for it, and we had all the actors back, and we even had William Macy to play the president, and then the financing fell through. It's so hard with movies, and especially, I don't know, I guess if I had been smarter somehow, I should have been able to finance that. But what happens with at least for me, is that I've always had to keep working. I have 4 kids, and I make independent movies, and so I always had to work. There's no way, and I didn't do big movies, so I couldn't just make one movie every 2 years or something. I had to keep going, and that means that you just have to jump on the next thing. And before I could get that financed, I'd moved to Indonesia to try to do a line of films there. And anyway, as everything evolved, I just somehow couldn't get those movies financed. And I eventually kind of brought them all down into one movie. I just made it Reanimator Unbound, and we got a script to it. Somehow could just kept just having the financing, and then it falls away, which is kind of the typical thing with movie making on the independent stage.
It would have been nice, but we unfortunately, it didn't happen, and I totally get that whole financing with films thing. It's nowadays it seems like studios are not wanting to take risks, and everything's got to be streaming, and it's got to be pre well-known established properties are getting the go light, and every once in a while we get like a film like I don't remember the name of it, but Michelle Yeoh had a film out earlier this year. It was like a multiverse film. Everywhere but here, or something like that.
Yeah, I saw that.
It was that film was such a risk to put out, because yes, Michelle Yeoh she's a big star. She's been on Star Trek. She's a huge Chinese star. But let's face it, the average person doesn't know who she is. And it's an entire mostly cast of Asians, with the exception of Jamie Lee Curtis is in it, but she's almost unrecognizable in it, and she's not billed as a star of that movie. So it was such a risk to put that movie out, and that movie had staying power at the box office. Every time I went to the theater since that movie came out, it was still playing.
It's odd because I think what most people don't realize, I think. What you don't realize if you're not in the business of, I don't know, financing and exploiting movies, is that, at least from my point of view, the movie begins with the financing, and the financing is sort of like the foundation upon which the house is made. And financing is inextricable. It's the other side of the coin from recouping, which is selling the movie, which is getting the money back.
Right.
One is you have to raise the money, and then you can always raise money if you can show how the investor is going to get it back, whether the investor is the studio or it's, say, your dentist. And getting the money back is, if you can't show how you can, if you don't have a plan to get the money back, you can't raise the money. When I started in the 80s, that was the era of video, of home video. And I started when the studios saw home video as a threat, and they wouldn't put their movies out there. And so there was this whole Wild West thing going on in the 80s, which was that anybody could sell to these mom and pop video stores. And everybody, all these shops, and this is before Blockbuster, so there wasn't any monopoly even. And every video store in every city across the country had to buy a whole bunch of VHSs because they had to stock their store. They were renting these tapes out. You could sell direct to them. So in the 80s, there were just all these different little companies that made movies so they could sell them to the video stores. And we see there's this whole style of movies when you look back on the 80s, especially in the horror realm. And then in the 90s, it all started monopolizing. So you started ending up with Blockbuster, which is kind of the Netflix of its time. And Netflix, as we see now, is going down because the competitions, Netflix came up, they took advantage of first the mail, but then to deliver broadband when broadband got big enough. And they were the first, they just got huge and controlled everything. And then, of course, Disney and Warner's and Discovery and Peacock, they all come in and do their own version of Netflix. And so it all monopolizes eventually. The problem was that when video started monopolizing, then certain companies started controlling what movies could get made. It couldn't be, Blockbuster became the big monopoly. And there were a couple other 21 Video, and I don't know, different regions of the country had certain chains. And the chains, like with Blockbuster, I remember when you worked with a a studio, and I'm talking about, you know, mini studios, not Disney and all that. Blockbuster would read the script, and then they would make a deal with you for how much shelf space you could get, and that's how much your budget could be. But still, for a movie to do well, they had to go theatrical. Well, once we got towards the end of the 90s, this whole model was not working for the small companies, but DVD kind of gave it another boost towards the end of the 90s. Once the digital came on strong, there quit being a market a mass market for physical video. And once that mass market for physical video was gone, all of a sudden it's really hard to make independent movies. And then the streaming started being the whole shebang. Now, if you'll remember, this crushed the record business 10, 15 years earlier than the movie business. Already in the 90s, streaming music crushed the LP and CD markets. You didn't have to buy a CD. You could download it because music uses up so much less bandwidth. So the development of the technology, the internet technology, killed the physical music business way earlier. And that's when all of a sudden, and then everybody gets used to the idea that they should get everything for free, because on the internet, you could just get it for free. You didn't have to pay. And that's when musicians, all of a sudden, they couldn't just make studio albums. They had to go out and perform again. Well, that happened well before the movies got hit with it. But the same thing happened. And so what's evolved is that, on the other hand, the digital technology also made it, you could make a movie for virtually nothing. So you can make a movie with your damned iPhone, and you can download After Effects and Final Cut, and anybody can make a movie. It'll look like a movie. And the camera, you don't even need to light it. You can just shoot an available light. Now, but these movies you can make like no budget movies, but there's no way to monetize it. And so mainly the independent movie makers are basically trying to do something that'll get the attention of, say, Netflix or the studios, who will then maybe hire them to make a studio picture or do a Netflix series or something, because there's no way for them to make their money back. I mean, maybe you make a movie for 30 grand. I think you could, if you're smart about it, you can get your money back, even 100, maybe 200. But I know I help people do that all the time. But it's, back in the 80s, you could make a movie and really get your money back and make money. Well, it's not like that anymore. And so I think it's very tough. And the movies themselves have changed their nature then. They're not, when you look back at the 80s and early 90s, the 80s have that whole VHS era. The movies have a certain, you can tell they're from that era, just like in the 70s. 70s is pre-video, and you can tell the kind, the Let's Scare Jessica to Death, or the Jallows, or the kind of movies that were coming out independently, and in the Last House on the Left and things like that in the 70s, has its own style to it, and the 80s certainly do. Right now, I think people there's a nostalgia kind of for the 80s, even but for the people who weren't around then. But now I think the movies in one way are really much slicker, and they're much more, anybody can really make a movie, but to a certain degree, a lot of them just aren't all that entertaining, And now theatrical has pretty much become like going to a museum or a rock concert.
That's true. This is true. I appreciate your insight into the industry, and really, like, it wasn't as much an interview, it was just like an educational experience with your thoughts and feelings about it. I appreciate it. I could go on even further, but unfortunately we are at time for what we can allow for the interview. But I thank you so much, Brian, for coming on and giving us just a really deep dive into your history and everything, and again, just an education on film in general. Where are you, just if you're working on something right now, why don't you plug what you're working on right now? Otherwise, why don't you give out any social media that you happen to be on?
Well, I think the only thing that you can find me on is Instagram. I really don't do it. I don't. I mean, I can be contacted there. I'm not a big social media guy, so I don't. I do have a Instagram channel, but I'm not like involved much. And the projects that I do have going, unfortunately, they the more developed they are, the less I can say anything, because you have, there's all, you have to agree to not talk about it. The one thing I can mention that I think is real interesting is I have a project based on the Beast of Blood movies from the Philippines in the early 60s. And I'm sure not many people will know about these, but there's 4 of them. I think it's Terror is a Man, The Beast of Blood, Brides of Blood, something of Blood Island. And these were really cheap movies made in the Philippines back in the early 60s that were just real exploitative, really cheap, and a lot of fun. They're like jungle monsters. And having lived I was actually born in the Philippines, actually. Yep. But I did try to do a whole label of films in Indonesia back in the 2000s, which got squashed by the Great Recession, and our financing fell through. But I lived there for a few years, and I made 2 movies there and developed a bunch more. But the thing that I loved about Indonesia was that it had all the kind of supernatural mythologies that you find across Southeast Asia. And they're just so different from the Western vampire, werewolf, Frankenstein, the typical Western ones. They have a different approach to it, and they have some really cool monsters. And a friend of mine, David Searing, who was responsible for a channel back in the 2000s called Monsters HD, that was part of AMC back then. He got the rights to these sequel rights to these movies, and we did a Kickstarter and made a comic book for the first quarter for 1/4 of what would have been a kind of a mini series, to try to do a modern version of those just monster, just another monster every 5 minutes kind of movies. And it's called, Blood Island. And I think we're doing another Kickstarter pretty soon to do the second issue of the comic. And we made the comic really so that because when you try to get financing for a movie and you give somebody something to read, they never read it, right? People don't like to read, but if you give them a comic, they'll look through the comic. So if you look out for the Beast of Blood comic book, or if you go on Kickstarter or something and look for it, I think this is a real. I think it's a lot of fun, and I think you can find. I think online, or I don't know how long they leave stuff up on Kickstarter after the thing is over, but I bet if you look up Beast of Blood Island, and you'll recognize the creature from classic movies. And I think it's just I just would love to do this thing, because it's just wild, kind of a monster coming at you every 5 minutes.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it sounds fantastic. I definitely hope it does happen. Brian, again, thank you so much for coming on Radio of Horror. It's definitely been one of my bucket list interviews to have you on for quite some time, so I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.